Thank you all for joining today. For those who don't know me, my name is Laura Schnurr. I'm the Director of Community Climate Transitions here at Tamarack Institute. And I'm joining today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, colonially known as Quebec, Chelsea, Quebec. I'm grateful to the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. And as I watch the patterns of this land change and watch with horror as fires burn across the country, 4,300 total this past year to date, as smoke pollutes our otherwise clean air, and as once in a lifetime floods hit Nova Scotia and other regions across the country, I'm thinking a lot about the deep connections between our climate systems and weather patterns and the processes of colonization and industrialization. I'm reminded of the inextricable links between the work ahead to promote Indigenous sovereignty and rights and achieve the truth and reconciliation calls to action, and the work to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. These are not separate pursuits, but deeply interconnected. Our guest speaker is Seth Klein. I first connected with Seth a few years ago when I was working at the McConnell Foundation, and he was working on his book, A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And I had the honor of getting to read the manuscript before it was published, which was really exciting. And when I did read it, I thought, now here is a great roadmap for how Canada needs to respond to the crisis. And every time Seth and I connect, we inevitably end up discussing issues around the role of the state, the role of the grassroots movements, social movements, and how this all kind of plays out with, Tamarack being an organization very focused on supporting grassroots, community-led, bottom-up processes, and Seth's work being focused on the role of the state in many ways, and of course, all those other elements coming in as well. So I thought it'd be really fun to have him join us. So as mentioned, he's author of A Good War. He's also team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. And prior to that, he worked for 22 years as founding director of the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the CPA. He's also a columnist with the National Observer, an adjunct professor with Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies program, and remains a research associate with CCPA's BC office. So Seth, thank you for being here with us today, and let's dive in.
Thanks, Laura. I had forgotten that you were at McConnell and read the manuscript. That's fun, but it's great to be with you. And I want to acknowledge with gratitude that I am joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations.
Thank you, Seth, and thank you everyone who's introduced yourself, continuing to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's great to see everyone coming from really across the country and I know some internationally as well. So just excited for this conversation. And I'd love to kick it off, Seth, with a question that's quite kind of broad and looking at how you established the Climate Emergency Unit and sharing a bit more about CEU's mission and focus. Why don't we start there?
Sure. Well, it's the CEU is very much intertwined with the book that you referenced, A Good War. The book came out just shy of 3 years ago. And the contention I'm making in the book is that what we've been doing is not working. We are failing to bend the curve on our greenhouse gas emissions at anything close to the pitch and pace that the science and justice says we have to do, and that we needed a new approach. The twist of the book, for those who don't know, is that it's all structured around lessons from the Second World War as an example of, oh, this is what it means, and this is what it looks and sounds and feels like to actually be in emergency mode. When the book came out, I started to meet with elected political leaders across the country, federally, provincially, from different parties. These were really fun meetings. Turns out, Laura, there's a bunch of, maybe this isn't surprising, but there's a lot of World War II buffs among them. So you have these, quite enjoyable conversations, and then nothing happens. And really, this speaks directly to the title that you gave this webinar of the Grasstops and the Grassroots and Grasstops, We were having Grasstops conversations, but Grasstops conversations by themselves don't work. And I very quickly realized that nothing was going to happen if there wasn't political pressure from below, if there wasn't a drumbeat from below pushing political leaders into emergency mode, signaling to them that they would be rewarded for doing so or punished for not doing so. And so David Suzuki and Tara Cullis gave me this home with the David Suzuki Institute to create this thing that we called the Climate Emergency Unit. It's a small team across the country. We function virtually. And the idea is to press our leaders into emergency mode with wartime scale responses to the climate crisis. We don't primarily organize individuals. The model of the CEU is to organize organizations to try to encourage the formation of coalition tables around genuine emergency ideas. So we do that provincially, federally, sectorally, so that's the basic model of the CEU. Oh, and I should say, and maybe I could just share, in terms of the framework that we use, and maybe I'll just screen share for a second. Drawing from the book, we offer up this framework of what does it mean to actually be in emergency mode. You would hit these 6 markers. You spend what it takes to win. You create new economic institutions to get the job done. You shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. You commit to tell the truth about the severity of the crisis. You commit to leave no one behind, and you center Indigenous leadership rights and title. So we offer this framework up. We employ it all the time, but we also offer it up to others as a way of assessing, is your government actually in emergency mode? Is this climate plan a real climate emergency plan? It works federally, it works provincially, it works municipally, and just as equally, you can use this framework with any large institution, a post-secondary institution, a faith institution, a trade union. This is a framework for assessing is the leadership actually meeting the emergency?
Great. I like this framework so much. And thanks for sharing the visual and a bit more background on how you got started and really how Climate Emergency Unit evolved out of a good war. And that has been very apparent. I think anyone following the organization and having read the book, you really see it. It's like putting the ideas into action. So I want to ask you a bit more about the role of the state in this, because in a good war, a central argument revolves around how the state, particularly the federal government, needs to play a leadership role in ushering in a just and equitable climate transition. Could you share a bit more about some of the reasons you think this in particular is so critical?
Yeah, and earlier you sort of surfaced and named a bit of a tension in the model that we employ versus Tamarack. Although I think the truth is we need it all, right? You're doing organizing at the community level, and that's vital. But a core contention and this comes out of my study of emergencies, the study of the Second World War, our experience in COVID and in the climate emergency, is that when you truly face an emergency and you must do something dramatic, you must hit speed and scale in a small window of time, it has to be state-led. And that when it comes to the climate emergency, as important as it is to encourage households to change what they do, industry and business to change what they do, communities to do what they need to do, if we are counting on sufficient numbers of households and communities and businesses to voluntarily do what needs to be done, we're fried. Sometimes the metaphor I use, and I think it's a very apt one this summer, if a community is facing threat from a wildfire, we don't tell them we encourage you to leave. We say we're declaring a state of emergency and you have to go. That's what marker 3 means around shifting from voluntary to mandatory. And similarly, when you look at the federal government's approach to date, they're starting to bend the curve on our greenhouse gas emissions. But as I said, not at the pitch and pace required. Why is that? I would say they're basically stuck trying to incentivize our way to victory. When you look at the core federal climate policies to date, it's the carbon price, it's this basket of tax credits. We offer rebates and encouragements. This is no way to prosecute the battle for our lives. Sometimes I give the example from World War II that, the Americans joined 2 years after Canada did. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. In February of 1942, meaning 2 months later, the last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. And for the next 4 years, their production and sale was basically illegal. Now, that didn't happen because of the voluntary goodwill or patriotism of the big three automakers. It happened because they were ordered to shift what they were producing. So ultimately, for us to achieve what we need to achieve, it is my view that it has to be state-led. But to the point of the title of your webinar, they won't do it unless we make them do it. And that is the interplay between the grassroots and the Grasstops.
Fantastic. You've already really gone to the heart of the conversation today. So I love that. And you've spoken about the importance of grassroots movements in getting the state to act just now. But I wonder if you could unpack that a little more around how civil society, grassroots groups, and social movements can really play into this and do so effectively.
Well, first of all, our governments aren't there yet. I mean, I showed you before the 6 markers, and the federal government in World War II pretty much hit the first 5. I would say the federal government in the first year of COVID pretty much, with certain exceptions, but mostly hit all of them. But with respect to the climate emergency, neither our federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe, it's not just that they don't hit all of them, Laura, they don't hit any of them. So they need to feel this pressure. They have yet to make a political calculus that they will be rewarded for doing what needs to be done. Part of the MO of the climate emergency unit in particular is that when I said before, we're trying to create coalition tables, but we are particularly keen to create coalition tables and drawing in large institutions from outside the traditional environmental movement. And I think this is key. And this speaks to the strength of your network. I think these political leaders are only going to start to move, not just when they start hearing the demand for climate emergency action from the climate and environment groups, but from health organizations, from municipal city councils, from indigenous organizations, from labor organizations, from faith institutions. That's when the magic's going to happen. And that is starting to happen, but not yet at scale. And I think and this is partly why we offer up this 6-marker framework. I think there are a lot of those institutions, faith institutions, labor organizations, many of them have passed climate emergency motions, but they're all wrestling with how to make that real. How to put some meat on the bones, if you'll pardon the non-vegetarian reference there. But and so we offer up the framework to all of them to say, use this as a guide for what it means to actually be in emergency mode.
To follow up to that, you mentioned the importance of having that message come from many different messengers, and the season we're in, this of extreme weather and all the loss that's coming with that and all the grief people are experiencing. Is there particular messaging that you think is effective at this time? And what's the opportunity in a sense, and not to turn this tragic losses into an opportunistic framing, but how should we go about thinking about this?
I hear in your question both about message and messenger, and they're both important. In terms of the message, I would highlight in particular marker 4 there about telling the truth. too much of our climate communications, well, it often falls in one category or another. It often feels kind of Pollyanna, kind of trite. And where, I'm quite critical of years of the environmental movement itself, individualizing the solutions. Or on the other extreme, it's so much doom that you're just paralyzed with fear. The communicators we most remember from the Second World War, they found this remarkable space in the middle of both being forthright with the public about the severity of the threat, honoring people with the truth. And the truth is, this is grim, and we do not have the situation in hand. And yet still managing to impart hope and a sense that that all was not lost and that we could do this. That's what we're aiming for. All of us who are climate communicators. And we need to be better about it. And we need to boost the level of climate literacy. When you look at the Canadian polling, what it tells you is the good news is that a solid majority of Canadians get that it's an emergency now. Strong majorities want to see stronger action, bolder action. But when you press them on what that action should be, they go right to recycling and plastics, because that's what we've heard for 30 years. And in fact, only about half of the Canadian public correctly understands that the major source of global warming is the combusting of fossil fuels. So there's a huge communications job to do around boosting that literacy and connecting these extreme weather events to climate change, to fossil fuels and what we burn in our vehicles and our homes. And then you raise the messenger question, and we do want to hear our politicians speak the truth, but it can't just be from them. And this again taps into the strength of your network. We need to hear from health experts. We need to hear from scientists. Those are the most credible sources on this. We need to hear much more from them. And faith leaders and labor leaders, like and teachers, like, again, just to be your weird uncle again with the war, like, I think if you were a student or a person of faith going to a religious institution during World War II, everything about the experience, what you heard from the front of the room, told you that you were doing that at a time of emergency, and we're not there yet.
Thanks. You listed so many really important actors and messengers in this. And I'm thinking about people with lived and living experience with climate injustice as well here. At Tamarack, a key aspect of our work is supporting communities to do that community engagement, hear from residents, co-create shared vision, common agenda for change, and really putting residents, and especially those with lived and living experience, in the challenges we're looking to solve at the heart of decision-making and planning processes. Which brings me to the question.
Yes, thank you so much for raising that.
Yeah, just wondering what if you think there's a role, and what that role is for those community voices with lived experience developing effective policies and programs.
Well, I think the role is vital. So first of all, when it comes to mapping out a plan, certain things shouldn't be open for debate, right? Like the targets themselves need to be guided by science, but how we achieve those targets very much needs to be out of a robust consultation process. In the book, I talk about the value of citizen assemblies or different kinds of deep engagement like that, and all, under that old adage of nothing about us without us. And strategically, that's key. I mean, if people feel like, the mobilization is just orders from on high, it ain't gonna work. People need to feel like they're a part of it. But your question also brings me to marker 5 and 6 in the framework for emergency, which is leave no one behind and center Indigenous leadership and rights and title. There are some climate policy wonks out there who often say, don't connect the climate fight with the fight against inequality or all these other social justice issues. Don't weigh it down. It's hard enough as it is. And I believe they're absolutely wrong. And that I hope people see as a thread through the book. I think they're wrong because these issues are inherently connected. Like the richer you are, the higher your emissions, the poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to climate impacts, and you end up structuring climate policy. If you fail to do this, you structure climate policies that disproportionately harm lower income people or working people, and then you alienate them. But also we need to link these things because that's how we win. This is a key lesson out of my study of the Second World War. A genuine mobilization requires social solidarity. Inequality is toxic to social solidarity. If we are failing to support lower income households in particular, if we are failing to provide a robust, exciting, hopeful, just transition plan, then the populist right wing is going to paint the climate mobilization as some elite exercise. That's what they're doing. And too often our governments follow that script because they fail to do what you've just raised.
100% agree. And I really love that framing in your book. And it's a framing, of course, central to community climate transitions and our work at Tamarack in our history and poverty reduction, social belonging, and youth. So I'm picturing kind of the ecosystem now because you've really made a strong case around the role of the state and federal, provincial, territorial, local governments, the case of grassroots organizations, civil society, their role in this, people with lived experience of climate injustice, and we didn't get into some of the other important sectors, but maybe we can later. But what makes for a successful and productive interactions and dynamics between those bottom up and top down strategies? And would love if you could share an example of when you've seen that working well.
Well, I think you've set me up, Laura, because I have a very biased story to tell when it comes to this, as you know, but many of your guests here may not. My wife is a Vancouver City Councillor, Christine Boyle, who 4.5 years ago introduced the first climate emergency motion in English Canada. And out of that, Vancouver has a genuine climate emergency plan that hits all 6 markers. It's a bit stalled out in its new council, but it's made a huge amount of progress. And in particular, and this is for all of you watching now who work in the community sector, the key thing that Vancouver does in its plan relates to marker 3, moving from voluntary to mandatory. In Vancouver, as of a year ago, last January, new buildings, because of this climate plan, new buildings cannot use fossil fuels for space and water heating. That's huge. That's like 10 years sooner than the provincial targets. And in many parts of the country, we don't even have such targets. That's emergency, my friends. So Vancouver doesn't, lots of communities have passed climate emergency plans. And to be honest, in most cases, it was just some symbolic motion. That's not true in Vancouver. Vancouver, Chris's motion gave staff 90 days, that's emergency, 90 days to come up with a new municipal plan that would align with the IPCC targets. And her motion passed, the plan passed, but they both passed unanimously, which is interesting because that last council was very politically diverse. They were all over the political spectrum, Laura, and you never knew how this gang was going to vote on anything. And yet they passed unanimously, which is now I'm being very long-winded, but now I will come directly to your question, which is how did that happen? How did that happen? How is it that in Vancouver, climate emergency action didn't become a political wedge issue like we so often see provincially and federally? So, well, part of it is my wife's really good at her job and very convincing, but she would say that if a couple of things happened. First of all, sometimes I think about this as like 3 legs of a stool. The stars really aligned 4.5 years ago in Vancouver, which is that you had leg 1, a political champ, who happened to be my wife in this case. Leg 2, you had a senior staff at the city in their sustainability office and in the city manager at the time who really got climate and were both committed and very skilled. But the third leg has to do with what you folks do. It was about that community pressure. And that came from a number of climate groups and CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. But in particular came from young people in this case. You know, when Chris is asked, how did it pass unanimously? What she says is, each time those key votes happened, dozens of high school students skipped school. They rallied outside. They spoke before council. They filled the galleries and watched. And in this charged environment of where the intergenerational justice issue was just thick in the air, that they made it politically impossible for even the more conservative councillors to vote no, that they in fact did that. And that was that interplay of those three elements where we got a real plan.
Amazing. You're right. I had heard that story before in your book, but I love it every time. And I really appreciate the role that youth played in that, because youth are so critical in this. And as you said, the school strikes, the protests, the mobilization, the way they've convinced older generations, like, this is our future, you need to act. Which leads me to my next question around the Youth Climate Corps, because you have a really exciting initiative around mobilizing youth behind the climate emergency. And could you share a little bit more about that and how you see youth role?
Yeah, thanks for that opening. So we, back to your very first question. So at the CEU, we convene these coalition tables and sort of joint campaigns. We're involved in with CAPE in this campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising, which is one people might be interested in. We're in part of the BC climate emergency campaign, the Ontario climate emergency campaign. There's a nascent just transition coalition coming together in Newfoundland. But we also house two of these, what we see as flagship campaigns with the CEU that speak in particular to the fact that on marker 5, leave no one behind, the federal government hasn't, credit where it's due. They're doing stuff on climate, but they have yet to make that compelling counteroffer to fossil fuel workers and communities and frontline communities and Indigenous communities that feel dependent on these industries, and to young people looking for a future. There isn't that exciting counteroffer. We have yet to be all invited to meet this moment together. And so we have two campaigns. I know we're going to talk about both, the Just Transition Transfer and the Youth Climate Corps. So let me tell you a bit more about that. I know you already shared with the registrants the link to the page. I encourage people to go there, and there's a really great 2-minute video about the Youth Climate Corps there. But let me make this personal for a moment. You mentioned off the top the summer we're having. And here in Western Canada, we've lost 3 firefighters in the last 2 weeks. In this province, a 19-year-old young woman named Devin Gale. So just to again be your weird uncle again, in the war, Canada was a population of just over 11 million people. From that, over 1 million of them enlisted, which is remarkable. And of those, 64% of them were under the age of 21, which blows my mind. And they left their farms, they delayed their careers, they deferred their studies because they understood the emergency to be in that moment. You don't wait in the face of an emergency. So I think often, like, who are those young people today? And they're her. They're this 19-year-old woman, Devin Gale. The idea of the Youth Climate Corps, I give a lot of talks to young people and in post-secondary settings. I am convinced that there are tens of thousands of young people, again, who get the emergency, are ready to serve, who want to meet the moment. And we have yet to issue them an invitation to do so. What if we had a genuine national program that said to everyone under 35, if you get the emergency and you want to spend 2 years helping us meet this challenge, getting trained up in skills that you could use maybe for the rest of your career, then we have a place for you and no one will be turned away. Truly grand like that. Now, as you know, there's a ton of youth training and employment programs out there across the country. Most of them are small, most of them are short term, a lot of them are unpaid, and often are oversubscribed. You have to apply to get in. There is only one national, state level, as I say, truly national youth employment and training program that is genuinely barrier-free, especially for young people from a disadvantaged background. And we all know what it is. It's the Army. And we ought to do better. So we're imagining something where people would spend 2 years. They could be doing emergency response, in the face of floods and fires and so on, like this young woman. They could be doing work that is about building resilience, both for community and natural systems, to make them more resilient in the face of these coming events. But both of those two things, those two buckets are both sort of adaptive. But the vital third bucket of activity is the things that will actually drive down emissions so that we can get ahead of the curve. So the building retrofits, the renewable energy projects, et cetera, and getting trained up in those sorts of skills. There are 10 million Canadians today between the ages of 18 and 35. If only 5% of them said, yeah, that I get that, I want to do that, it's 500,000 people. That's emergency.
Thank you. Really love the Youth Climate Corps idea, really supportive of it. And thanks for sharing today. You've said before, the invitation's not there. People are ready and people want to get involved, but where's the invitation from the government? And I think you've crafted a beautiful invitation, and I hope the federal government adopts this as a program. The other program flagship initiative you spoke about very briefly is the Just Transition Transfer. And that's something that is really exciting for us here at Tamarack as strong advocates of subsidiarity principle. So pressing social and environmental issues should be dealt with at the lowest, most immediate level possible, and that communities, provinces, territories require resources to adequately respond to the emergency. So if you could speak a little bit more about that campaign, and then also how everyone on the call today can support both of these campaigns, that would be great.
Yeah, you're right, Laura. I think the Just Transition Transfer idea is actually a great fit for Tamarack and the people part of your network. It is another attempt to do something big that actually communicates emergency, but at the same time, tackle really a confederation conundrum that we face when it comes to climate. In many respects, Canada, there are certainly academics who would argue that Canada is the most decentralized federation in the industrialized world, for better or for worse. But it does complicate climate action. And in particular, it complicates climate action because much of the key climate infrastructure we need, so renewable energy, zero emission, affordable housing, public transit, all of that type of stuff, comes under municipal, provincial, or indigenous jurisdiction. But it's the feds who have the greatest capacity to pay. The Just Transition Transfer tries to bridge that. So, and just to give you a little context here, the idea for it actually came out of a book one of the interviews for my book with Gil McGowan, the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. Now, Gil's pretty good on climate. He may well be among labor leaders, the one who most speaks the truth. But Gil was also making the argument that the rest of Canada needs to appreciate that places like Alberta have a heavier lift to do, that they're more reliant on fossil fuels. So we cooked up this idea for the Just Transition Transfer. The key to it would be, first of all, it would be big, like 25 billion a year, like a 1% of GDP. That's, by the way, more than double what the feds currently spend on climate. Second, though, it would be different from most other federal transfers in two important ways. So if you think about health transfers or education transfers, and it would be these two ways. First of all, instead of divvying the money up by population, we would divvy the money up by greenhouse gas emissions. So Alberta's the source of 38% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, about 4 times their share of the population. We would freeze that in time and we would say, okay, Alberta, you're going to get 38% of the money, recognizing that Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland have a bigger job to do to get off fossil fuels. But the second twist, we wouldn't send the money to those provincial governments. No offense to anyone listening, but they're not to be trusted on this. Instead, we would have just transition agencies in every province, and maybe at the community level as well, to receive the money, and in some cases directly to Indigenous communities. And you would have governance shared by the feds, municipalities, provinces if they ante, and vitally Indigenous nations. But we could all have comfort knowing that the money was being used for its intended purposes and not just being absorbed into provincial budgets. But, you know, and I'm sure this is something that many of your the people in your community can really appreciate. When it comes to affordable housing, when it comes to public transit, municipal governments are constantly having to go cap in hand every 2 years, you know, trying to secure new money. The just transition transfer could be a way of providing large, stable, multi-year funding for the infrastructure we need to drive down our emissions and get off fossil fuels. And so to what I would say to people listening, we really need your help on both of these campaigns, the Youth Climate Corps and the Just Transition Transfer. We have drafted up a sample municipal resolution or motion in support of the Just Transition Transfer, which I'll send to you and maybe you can share with registrants. Because I think if we're going to win something big, and whether it's called Just Transition Transfer or Sustainable Jobs Transfer, whatever, but it's going to be because labor organizations, municipal governments, Indigenous governments, housing authorities, transit authorities, public utilities are saying we need this. And you know, your network is well placed to try to help with that organizing.
Thanks for sharing. And I agree. I think a lot of folks on the call will be really keen to support this campaign and learn more about it. And as we transition into the Q&A now, looking at some really juicy questions for you in the Q&A box. And one really connects to that topic, and it's around the role of municipal governments specifically, because earlier you had more of a focus on the federal level. So anything else you could share about that?
Well, as I shared with the Vancouver story, you know, first of all, if your municipality hasn't declared a climate emergency in some way or another, it should. But the reality is that many of them have, and yet it's just symbolic. So we do need genuine municipal climate emergency plans. That is something you all can work on. I would invite you to use the 6 markers as a framework for developing and assessing those plans. That said, again, you know, one of the ironies we face in Canada is that at the municipal level, we actually have seen emissions going down, and all of that good work has been undone by the expansion of the fossil fuel sector and the oil sands in particular, which is why there remains a vital provincial and federal advocacy role for all of us and municipal governments, saying, look, don't make us chumps here. We don't want to do good work and have it undone. We need to get off fossil fuels. The leadership there has to come from federal and provincial governments. And even, you know, I shared with you that the key, there's many things Vancouver is doing, but the key thing is what they're doing on buildings, because in any given city, generally more than 50% of the emissions is the gas we burn in buildings, right? But Vancouver was lucky because by historic anachronism, Vancouver has its own building code. Most municipalities don't have their own building code. Now, there's a lot of clever stuff people can do, and a lot of municipalities are doing their best to kind of do what they can within the powers that they have. But mostly, we need the provincial governments to take them all out of their misery and make it the law of the land that new buildings can't tie into gas lines. And I can't overemphasize how important this is. Like, let me just give you an example from my province. Our province and BC Hydro have a very active program getting people to swap to electric heat pumps. We have municipal governments that are doing their best. And yet Fortis BC, which is our big gas utility, in much of the country, it's Enbridge, they're buds. Fortis BC every year ties in more than 10,000 new homes to gas lines. Like, they're running circles. They're making a mockery of our efforts to electrify. And until the provincial governments say that game's over, we're going to have a really hard time getting ahead of the curve.
There are so many points there that I'd love to dive into. And one of them is around the fossil fuel industry and their role in this and the power of the lobby, which is a question from one of our audience members, Anne here, who asks about this tremendous power of the fossil fuel industries, where lobbyists are meeting with our MPs on average 5 times per working day, and whose PR firms are filling our space with misinformation. And there's a mention of the Pathways Alliance news that I'm sure many of us have seen today. And how do we deal with this? How do we effectively address this and make our case and mobilize grassroots while recognizing that there's the strength of the lobby on the other side, trying to block everything that we should, all of our successes and efforts?
Such an important question. The fossil fuel power and influence in all of this cannot be overstated. It's been key to what has held us back. And both in the form of the lobbying and the advertising and just the political and economic influence. By the way, just to get slightly distracted for a moment here, if in a few days you can't remember all 6 markers, I'll share with you a little shorthand heuristic for a little shortcut for assessing, is a plan a real climate emergency plan? And that is, look at the reaction of the fossil fuel companies. If reps from the fossil fuel companies are on the stage with the government saying we can get behind this plan, you ain't got a plan. If, on the other hand, you can see some panic in the whites of their eyes, then maybe you got a plan. And that was Chris's experience in Vancouver, by the way. When she was working on the development of the Vancouver Climate Emergency Plan, and right at the end, before it went public, and Fortis BC got a briefing and reacted with some panic, for her, that was the cue that they actually had that they'd landed. Sometimes you got to invite their hate. The questioner mentioned the Pathways Alliance. That we have been inundated with that advertising everywhere. And the bad news is it works. What we see in the polling is that the public has largely accepted the message from the Pathways Alliance. These are the 6 major oil sands companies, that we can both be climate leaders while still expanding the extraction and production of fossil fuels. And yet that is not true. And by the way, when the Pathways Alliance says, we're going to be net zero by 2050, they're just talking about their production emissions. Now, even that's fanciful. They're going to try to carbon capture and storage their way to net zero, but it's not capturing what happens when the oil and gas they extract actually gets shipped and burned somewhere else. It's like Philip Morris telling you that none of the workers in their factory smoked. I mean, who gives a damn? So we do need to tackle the lobbying and the advertising, and we should. So that's where CAPE has taken leadership on this fantastic campaign that anyone can join to ban fossil fuel advertising, just like we did with cigarettes. If this is an emergency and knowing the harms, why do we allow the advertising? And on the lobbying, we can regulate that too. You know, we could pass laws that say elected leaders can't meet with fossil fuel representatives. You know, if some flunky lower down the line needs to meet with them, that's fine. But they should not be consuming the agendas and time of our elected leaders in the face of an emergency. That's just wrong. I know that some municipal governments have tried to tackle this advertising question themselves, like Regina tried and then got bullied out of it by their provincial government. But I would say this is a good one for people to dig into, trying to get fossil fuel sponsorship and advertising banned at a local level, at a provincial level, at a federal level, because even before we win, and we will, it actually helps boost climate literacy, connecting the dots for people that these are the companies that are driving climate change.
Great answer. And relates to actually a couple of the questions in the Q&A. And one is around misinformation and polarization, and how some of that misinformation, and we've been seeing more and more lately, has really been designed to incite public anger over potential climate solutions. And there's a mention of the 15-minute cities thing the past months has been quite upsetting to follow. And the question is around how can governments make climate measures mandatory at the speed and scale we truly need without inciting public backlash? That comes from Tara.
Very important question too. So first of all, as I was getting at earlier, our governments should not fall into these traps. Their failure to hit marker 5 in particular allows climate to be painted as this elite thing, and it gives fodder to the populist right. All of us who work in this space get inundated with trolls on this stuff, but that can also give a false impression. Look, the misinformation is certainly problematic. I don't want to say it's of no consequence. It is problematic, and it saps our ambition, and it's distracting, and it's demoralizing. But I would say to people, look at the polling and take heart, because as much as the fossil fuel companies and those other nefarious interests fuel this stuff, the public opinion polling in Canada tells us that a very large majority of Canadians get the emergency and want to see action. And on the flip side, what my study of emergencies from World War II and COVID and climate tell me is you never have unanimity. There are always antisocial elements who oppose these things, and that's fine. You don't need unanimity. But it can be done. This is, again, particularly, it speaks to the importance of mandates and marker 5 on leave no one behind. Let me tell you another war story, Laura. At the beginning of the war, the governments of Canada, the United States, the UK, they were all very nervous that they might have to bring in rationing, and that they would experience a kind of popular revolt in the face of that. And yet, as the war proceeded, they did have to bring in rationing. And it didn't unfold at all the way they thought it would. In fact, rationing was one of the most popular things that happened, because it meant everyone could do their bit, but also they could do their bit without feeling like chumps, knowing that everybody else was going to have to do their bit too. That's the benefit of truly equitable mandates that way. But one final point on this, we do need to push back on misinformation. There are 2 other campaigns I want to mention that we have. One is for a climate Emergency Information Board, well funded. Like, we've all been inundated by the ads from the Pathways Alliance. Where the heck's the government advertising? Telling us about how it needs to happen. But, there's a bit of advertising from Environment Canada about natural solutions that kind of go out of their way not to talk about fossil fuels. And then the other more quiet campaign we have is directed to the CBC itself, our public broadcaster. They've gotten a bit better. They've in particular gotten better about connecting extreme weather events to climate change, but not about connecting climate change to fossil fuels. But messaging is about ubiquity. Like, one of the ideas that we have, and it too comes out of the book, for all of you who listen to CBC radio every morning, I guess I would put this to you. If we can have hourly sports and business reports, surely to God, we can have a morning climate emergency report telling us how the battle for our lives is unfolding at home and abroad. That communicates emergency and starts to mobilize us.
Thank you. There's a question, a really quick one. Where do you get your information and news, Seth? And what's the best information for people to access?
Ooh, well, because of the line of work I'm now in, I am on a lot of morning climate newsletters that kind of fill my inbox every morning. And probably not to the healthiest degree. It's sort of like starting the day, doom scrolling, the unraveling of the world. But there are a number I would recommend. First of all, internationally, Carbon Brief has a daily newsletter, and The Guardian out of the UK, really models how to do this. In the Canadian context, and I know I'm a bit biased because I'm a columnist there, but Canada's National Observer. You should subscribe, and every morning you get the headlines in your inbox. They do a great job. There's also a free service from the Energy Mix, which once a week has great Canadian headlines and community. They also have a municipal kind of great fit for you Tamarack folks that you can subscribe to, like with a focus on communities and cities. So those are, once you subscribe to Canada's National Observer, you know what column I never miss? Chris Hatch with the Observer, has a Sunday morning column that is sort of like the news of the week. And I never fail to read it. It's so useful.
Those are great
There's
recommendations.
a lot out there now. There's a lot out there. Some really great newsletters and podcasts and so on.
Agreed. And National Observer in Canada does great at climate coverage, and every morning I get their newsletter and stay on top of things and reconciliation issues as well. It's wild how quick an hour goes with you, Seth. There are other questions in the chat, especially one that had a couple votes on the pandemic and how that all played out with in your book. And then I know that you've written about that. Perhaps what we'll do is I can share remaining questions in case you want to add any thoughts on them in a follow-up email that we send, and then we can send out that in the next day or two. So we'll pause here. I have one final question for you before we go to closing, which is just if you have a call to action you'd like to share with learners today.
Yeah, let me offer some final call to action and also speak to that little pandemic question. So first of all, we talked about the Just Transition Transfer and the Youth Climate Corps. We need your help on those. We need those city governments, municipal governments, Indigenous governments, faith institutions, labor organizations, bringing their support to this, passing motions. We really want your help for that. If you find the climate emergency ideas and campaigns I've been talking about of interest, the best and easiest thing you should do is sign up for the CEU's newsletter, and maybe you can share the link for that. But if you, I'll try to throw the link in the chat right now, if you don't mind. Well, I'm getting distracted. I was going to just put the newsletter link in there, but maybe you can share afterwards. But then, every 2 to 3 weeks, you'll get the latest from us about each of these campaigns. I'll plant one other provocative idea. One of the curses of climate is that it moves in slow motion, and that these extreme events happen, they don't happen everywhere all at once. So they fail to galvanize us all at once. But this summer feels different. It's sort of everything everywhere all at once. And we should not come out of this summer of disruption and allow business as usual. For some people, that I guess the question I have is there some form of peaceful civil disobedience or something that creatively disrupts the normal, so that we don't go back to business as usual? And let me close by saying this in answer to that last question. I've mentioned different connections, similarities with COVID and the COVID response and so on, but there's an important difference. So people often say to me, oh, Seth, you're saying everyone, we need to be in emergency mode for so long, and yet look how people tired of emergency responses within less than a year in the pandemic. But there's an important difference, I think. The things we were called upon to do in the pandemic are really anathema to all of our social instincts. Isolate, stay home, mask up, be separate. That no wonder people tired of that. The good news for the climate emergency is that it calls on us to do precisely the opposite, to go out and do something grand together. And I think we can do that for a few years.
What a powerful way to close. Thank you, Seth. Thank you for all that you shared with us today with the community and for being here. So Racine, we just have a minute left, and my colleague Jamie put a feedback survey in the chat. We'd really love if you can share feedback. It helps us do better with all our webinars. Jamie shared the newsletter sign up for you as well, so folks have that, and how to sign up for upcoming events and webinars. And we have an exciting one around democratizing planning practices with radical cartography coming up early September. We have Community Climate Transitions annual national gathering in mid-November. So hope to see you all there. Thank you everyone for joining today, and yeah, we'll hope to see you soon.